This is the story of a decorated police officer, framed for a murder she didn't commit. And by her side through it all was her loyal German Shepherd, Ranger. While she awaited death behind bars, Ranger sensed the truth no one else believed, leading a former detective into a dangerous chase through Charleston's underworld. But when they finally uncover the conspiracy, they realize the real threat isn't just the criminals they can see. It's the powerful hand still pulling the strings. Charleston's harbor woke beneath a winter dawn that smelled of salt and iron. A damp mist curled along the water like a tattered curtain drawn across an old secret, and the live oaks that lined East Bay dripped with the night's rain. Over the Cooper River Bridge, the sky was the color of a fading bruise, streaked violet and gray as if the city itself bore the weight of something unspoken. Gulls wheeled in ragged circles, their cries faint against the hush that clung to the cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance a cargo ship's horn rolled out, low and mournful, as the tide licked at the old pilings beneath the wharves. Beyond the harbor, the courthouse stood like a ship anchored in stone, its pale columns weathered by centuries of storms. The gray morning light slid down the steps and through tall windows, touching wooden pews, worn smooth by generations of trials. Portraits of stern-faced judges stared down from the walls as if the living had yet to convince them that justice had changed. The city had been restless for months. A shadowy network called Crimson Viper smuggled contraband through the port and silenced witnesses with swift and surgical violence. The old warehouse district bore the scars of raids and gunfire. Merchants closed early, families stayed inside after dusk. Charleston, a city that prided itself on charm and tradition, now moved as if wary of its own reflection in the water. Against this uneasy backdrop, a single case had divided the city. Emily Carter, 32, a decorated officer known for her steadiness in a crisis and the quiet empathy that had won the trust of victims, now stood accused of murdering a key witness who was set to testify against the Crimson Viper. She sat at the defense table with her back straight, the posture of a woman who had once been trained to march and had never unlearned it. Her chestnut brown hair was drawn into a low, practical knot. Stray strands brushed a cheek that bore a small, pale scar beneath the right eye, the mark of a pursuit gone wrong years earlier. Her eyes, gray-green like river water under a clouded sky, showed the shadowed hollows of sleepless nights. Her uniform badge was gone, lying now in an evidence bag, but she still had the look of someone who would rather face a storm than bow to it. The prosecutor, Calvin Pierce, mid-40s, stood at his table with the calm poise of a man accustomed to convincing strangers. Lean and deliberate, his dark hair combed back with disciplined care, he carried himself like an athlete who had traded the field for the courtroom. A precise square jaw, a faint crease between his brows, eyes sharp as glass. He had a reputation for winning cases that others thought unwinnable. When he spoke, his gestures were measured, and his voice firm but never raised, the tone of a teacher confident his students would learn their lesson. Presiding over them was Judge Ruth McHenry, late 50s, small in stature, but known for a presence that could still a room. Her steel-gray hair was tied into a no-nonsense bun, and a thin scar traced from her left ear to her jaw, a souvenir of a long-ago car accident that had left her both grateful for life and intolerant of excuses. Her eyes from the bench were cool and steady, weighing each word as if it had physical heft. In the second row behind the bar sat Mark Dawson, 39, a former detective who had left the force when departmental politics began strangling real investigation. He had the shoulders of a man who had once been athletic, the slight stoop of someone used to leaning over case files late at night. His dark blonde hair thinned at the temples. A day's beard roughened the square set of his jaw, and his denim blue eyes carried the muted light of an idealist long since tested. Mark watched the defendant with a stillness that came from years of holding witness to things he could not easily forget. In the hallway beyond the courtroom door, separated by a pane of glass and the will of the court, a German shepherd waited. Ranger, 5 years old, broad-chested and powerful, wore a black and russet coat with a thick ruff at the neck that made him look like a sentinel carved in fur. His ears stood erect. His amber eyes held the calm focus of a dog trained to serve. Yet his gaze stayed fixed on the closed door. He had been Emily's partner since he was a young recruit. They had tracked fugitives, found lost children, stood together in more than one dark alley where neither of them had flinched. To Ranger, Emily was not just his handler, but the axis on which his whole world turned. The jury filed in, their footsteps soft against the old wooden floor. The foreman, a retired school principal in a blue blazer, handed the folded verdict to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The room grew so still that even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to lower in pitch. Judge McHenry opened the paper and read aloud, her voice steady, but her pause before the final word felt like a held breath. "On the charge of murder in the first degree," she said, "we, the jury, find the defendant, Emily Carter, guilty." A faint gasp came from the gallery, the soft clatter of a pen dropping. Emily did not flinch, only tightened her interlaced fingers, as if they were the last thing she could hold steady. Her defense attorney, a compact woman with strawberry blonde hair and a resolute jaw, leaned closer and murmured, "We'll appeal. We won't give up." In the hallway, the verdict struck like a thunderclap. Ranger shot to his feet, barking deep and sharp from the chest, the sound of a creature who had recognized something gone terribly wrong. He lunged forward, claws scraping on polished tiles, straining against the leash held by the young deputy, Cole Riggs, a farm-strong man in his early 30s, with the quiet patience of someone raised to fix things with his hands. "Easy, boy," Riggs said low, bracing his boots as Ranger pulled toward the door. When the door opened briefly for a passing officer, Ranger caught a glimpse of Emily at the defense table and stilled just long enough to let out a low, aching whine, the kind of sound that reached into the marrow of anyone who heard it. Emily turned her head slightly toward the noise, and for the first time during the trial, the hardness in her face softened. "Ranger," she breathed, a single word, half memory, half comfort. The door swung shut again. Ranger strained against the leash one last time, then stood rigid, eyes fixed on the barrier, as if by will alone he could break it down. He ignored the biscuit still lying at his feet. Deputy Riggs sighed, shifting his grip, but not his resolve. From the benches, Mark Dawson rose and stepped into the hallway. He crouched a short distance from the German Shepherd, speaking in the quiet tone once reserved for crime scenes and frightened children. "Hey, Ranger, you remember me?" The dog flicked an ear, but never shifted his gaze from the door. Mark saw in that unwavering stare something the jury had missed, an unspoken testimony of loyalty that doubted the verdict itself. He straightened, met the deputy's eyes. "Who's got custody of him now?" "K-9 unit, for the time being," Riggs replied. "But he won't eat, won't train. They're talking about retiring him early." Mark looked down again at the dog, saw the pricked ears, and the rigid posture of an animal refusing to accept the new order. "Then let me take him," Mark said quietly. "I'll sign whatever they need." Riggs hesitated, then nodded. "I'll let the sergeant know." As the courthouse buzzed behind them with the machinery of the law, and outside the harbor mist lifted to let a pale sun wash over the old city, Mark stood beside the dog, who had just defied a courtroom. In Ranger's silent vigil, he heard a call that stirred an old instinct, the one that had driven him as a detective to chase the truth, no matter where it hid. The day Charleston marked with a guilty verdict became for Mark Dawson the day he made a promise to find out what really happened. Mark Dawson drove home with Ranger that evening, beneath a sky the color of cold steel, the twilight settling like soot over Charleston's harbor. The old Ford truck he drove rattled along East Bay, as if protesting the damp wind off the Atlantic. In the passenger seat, Ranger sat upright, big paws planted on the mat, the thick ruff of his black and russet coat catching the fading light. His amber eyes never strayed from the road ahead, but his ears twitched each time a distant siren wailed. Mark glanced sideways now and then, struck by the dog's stillness. He had worked with canines before, seen them restless or alert, but never like this. So silent, as if holding something in that no one else could hear. Mark's house sat on the edge of the historic district, a narrow brick townhouse with peeling white shutters, and an iron fence that leaned a little from years of salt-laden winds. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. The living room was modest. 2 worn armchairs, a bookshelf crowded with case files and dog-eared novels, a single framed photo of Mark in uniform beside a younger partner, long since lost in a car crash. That loss had been one of the reasons he'd left the force. Grief had a way of hollowing a man out, leaving him leaner, slower to trust his own command. He dropped his keys on the table and looked at Ranger, who padded in without hesitation, but stopped halfway across the room, standing rigid in the soft lamp glow, as if waiting for instructions from a handler who wasn't there. "Easy, boy," Mark said, his voice low, the words carrying the hint of the Carolina drawl he'd never lost. He set down a steel bowl of water and another with dry kibble. Ranger sniffed at the food, then turned his head away, eyes sliding back to the door as though expecting Emily to walk in. Mark felt a tightening in his chest. He had seen men in combat look the same way, staring at a doorway for a brother who wasn't coming back. He sat on the edge of the armchair, elbows on his knees, watching the dog. "You're not the only one who thinks they got it wrong," he murmured. Over the next few days, Mark kept Ranger with him, walking the streets near the waterfront in the early mornings, when the city was still wrapped in mist. People turned to look, some recognizing the big German shepherd from old news reports about drug busts or rescues. Ranger ignored them, his focus fixed on the streets, as if searching for a scent only he could recognize. Mark noticed that the dog stiffened whenever they passed the courthouse or a police cruiser. The tip of his tail would flick, his ears pricking forward, then settling again. On the 3rd day after the verdict, Mark brought Ranger to the K9 Rehabilitation Center on the north side of town. The building was squat and practical, its concrete walls painted a tired beige, the yard enclosed by a chain-link fence. The place smelled of disinfectant, wet fur, and hope that didn't always last. Inside the reception area, a woman in her mid-30s looked up from behind a metal desk. She was tall and willowy, with auburn hair pulled into a ponytail, pale freckled skin that spoke of long hours outdoors, and the lean grace of someone accustomed to working with animals. Her name tag read Megan Holt. Her green eyes carried a mixture of patience and weariness that Mark recognized in people who had spent years mending things that others had broken. "Detective Dawson?" she asked, her voice even, but carrying a question. "You're here about Ranger." "Not detective anymore," Mark said with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just Mark. I'm fostering him now. I figured it might help to get him checked. See if he'll eat. Maybe talk to someone who knows how to work with these guys." Megan stepped out from behind the desk, her hands resting easily at her sides. "He was one of the best we had. I heard what happened. Some dogs. They take separation harder than others, especially if they feel the handler's in danger." She crouched a little, letting Ranger sniff her hand. The dog's nose twitched, his ears flicked. Then he stepped forward and touched his muzzle lightly against her palm. Megan smiled faintly. "Still has manners. That's good." She led them to the yard out back, where a few retired K9s rested under a shelter, watching the newcomers with old warrior eyes. Megan studied Ranger as he paced the perimeter once, then sat, ears forward, eyes on the gate. "He's waiting," she said quietly. "You see that posture? He's not adapting. He's on standby, like he expects her to call him back any minute." Mark folded his arms. The winter breeze caught his jacket, fluttering it slightly, and he watched Ranger with a look that carried both admiration and worry. "I need him to hold on. I've got questions about the case, things that don't sit right. If he's still this tied to her, maybe he knows something we don't. Megan glanced at him, one eyebrow lifting. You think the dog's going to testify? Not in words, Mark said, the corner of his mouth quirking. But maybe in where he looks, what he reacts to. Sometimes instincts pick up what evidence misses. Megan nodded slowly. Then, keep him close. Routine, quiet walks. Let him stay connected. He'll tell you when he's ready. That evening, Mark returned home with Ranger. He left a soft lamp on in the living room and sat at the table with his laptop, scrolling through old case files, reading the reports about the murder that had condemned Emily. The pieces felt too neat. A security camera conveniently catching her entering the warehouse. A single eyewitness whose statement had never wavered. A fingerprint on the weapon too perfectly placed. He rubbed a hand over his face, the stubble rasping beneath his palm. Ranger lay near the door, head on his paws, ears twitching as if in restless dream. Sometime, after midnight, Ranger rose suddenly, padded to the window, and let out a low, rumbling growl. Mark moved quickly to his side and peered out between the slats of the blind. The street outside lay empty, except for a parked car at the corner, its windows dark. The car started a moment later and eased away into the night. Mark's jaw tightened. His instincts stirred again, that old sense that someone was watching. The next morning, Mark took Ranger on a long walk along the riverfront. The tide was low, exposing stretches of muddy bank where gulls picked at stranded shells. Fishermen in worn jackets stood silent, their lines trailing into the slow water. As they passed the courthouse, Ranger's head lifted, ears angling forward, his stride slowing as he looked toward the steps where Emily had once climbed beside him. Mark reached down, resting a hand lightly on the dog's head. "We'll figure it out, partner," he said. Back at the house, Mark tried again to coax Ranger into eating. He knelt beside the dog, mixing a little warm broth into the kibble. Ranger sniffed, then finally began to eat, slow and deliberate, as if conceding to the moment. Mark felt a quiet relief at the small victory. It meant Ranger was still willing to go on. That night, Mark called an old contact at the precinct, a sergeant who had quietly respected him back in the day. The man's name was Earl Jennings, in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with a thick mustache, and the weary humor of someone who had spent 3 decades seeing too much of humanity's bad side. Earl's voice over the phone was gruff, but not unkind. "You're stirring the ashes again, Dawson?" "Something's off about this case," Mark said. "I can feel it. The evidence is too clean. I want to know who had access to the security footage the night of the murder." Earl grunted. "You didn't hear it from me. But that footage passed through Captain Hale's office before it went to the DA. That's all I'm saying." Mark thanked him and hung up, his thoughts already working the new piece into the puzzle. He looked at Ranger, who lay watching him, and spoke as if to a partner. "Looks like your handler was set up, buddy. We just have to prove it." Later, when the house had gone quiet, and the city outside settled into its night rhythms, Mark sat in the dim light, his elbows on the table, staring at the small stack of notes he'd made. Ranger rose, padded over, and sat beside him, leaning slightly against his leg. Mark reached down and rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth of the living creature beside him, and for the first time since Emily's conviction, he felt not alone in his resolve. The night along Charleston's waterfront was cold and brittle, the moonlight washing the old warehouses in silver and shadow. The air smelled faintly of brine and diesel, and the slap of water against the pilings echoed like the slow beat of a distant drum. Mark Dawson walked the narrow wooden pier, with his coat collar turned up against the wind, his steps careful on the damp boards. Beside him padded Ranger, his black and russet coat catching the moon's pale glow, ears pricked forward as if tuned to a frequency only he could hear. The city behind them was muted, its streets lit by sparse lamps and shuttered windows. To Mark, the stillness felt like the breath held before something long hidden exhaled. Ranger stopped suddenly. nose lifting toward the breeze that drifted from the east where the old harbor sheds stood. His body stiffened, muscles taut beneath the thick fur, and a low growl hummed in his chest. Mark felt the familiar prickle of an investigator's instinct. He had learned long ago to trust a canine's senses. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, scanning the dark shapes of the waterfront. The dog turned his head toward an abandoned warehouse near the waterline, its corrugated metal siding streaked with rust, a place Mark remembered from a report months back. Closed off after the witness's murder, but long since ignored by the authorities. The gate to the yard was chained loosely, the padlock old and flecked with salt. Mark crouched to examine it, running a thumb over the metal. It had been opened and closed recently. He glanced at Ranger. "Good nose," he said under his breath. The shepherd's tail gave a single slow sweep, not of excitement, but acknowledgement. They moved through the gate into the yard, their footsteps muffled by the grit and damp sand. Inside, the warehouse smelled of old wood, oil, and something faintly chemical. The moonlight filtered in through broken panes, painting thin white bars across the floor. Ranger moved ahead, his nose near the ground, pausing, then pulling Mark gently toward a corner where a collapsed stack of pallets leaned against the wall. Mark followed, heart thudding more from anticipation than exertion. Ranger pawed at the packed earth beneath the pallets, then began to dig with quick, sure motions, the dirt scattering behind him. Mark knelt to help, his fingers brushing something pliant, yet resistant beneath the soil. When he pulled it free, his breath caught. It was a fragment of something like skin, but cooler to the touch and faintly elastic. In the dim light, it had a strange, unnatural texture. Mark turned it in his gloved hands, the edges frayed as if torn from a larger piece. Ranger sniffed at it and gave a sharp huff, as if recognizing some scent that carried memory of the night everything had gone wrong for Emily. Mark bagged the fragment carefully in a plastic evidence pouch from his coat pocket, a habit he had never abandoned even after leaving the force. He glanced around the dark warehouse, the shadows crowding in as if guarding their own secrets. "Come on, partner," he whispered to Ranger. "We've got something to show somebody." The next morning, the pale sun lifted over the harbor as Mark drove to a modest brick office building downtown that housed a small investigative news outlet. The lobby smelled of paper, old coffee, and faintly of printer toner. The woman who greeted him at the front desk had sharp eyes and an impatient tone, pointing him toward a glass-walled office where a young reporter worked behind a cluttered desk. Nina Brooks looked up as they entered. In her late 20s, she had the lean frame of someone who often skipped meals to meet deadlines. Her hair was a rich chestnut brown, cut in a practical shoulder-length bob that framed a face marked more by determination than softness. Her brown eyes were quick and watchful, and there was a light dusting of freckles across her nose, the kind that somehow made her look both approachable and unyielding. She wore a faded denim jacket over a plain black tee, and her desk was strewn with notebooks, pens, and a half-empty coffee mug that bore the words, "Truth Matters." Mark had known her only by reputation, one of the few local journalists unafraid to name powerful people in her stories. She stood as he entered, offering a firm handshake. "Mark Dawson, I've read your name in some old case files," she said, her voice low and even, with the slight rasp of too many late nights. Her eyes flicked to Ranger, whose head came up slightly, as if measuring her. "And this must be the famous K9. I heard about what he did at the courthouse." "He's the reason I'm here," Mark said, lowering himself into the chair opposite her desk. He pulled the evidence pouch from his coat and set it on the table. "Found this last night near the old harbor warehouse. I figured you might know what to make of it." Nina leaned forward, her brows furrowing as she studied the fragment through the plastic. She reached out, but stopped short of touching it. "Where did you say you found it?" "In the ground, near the warehouse where they claimed Emily went in to kill that witness." Nina's eyes sharpened, the focus of a hunter catching a trail. I've been digging into some whispers about advanced synthetic masks, stuff smugglers use to get past security cameras. It's experimental, mostly rumored to be used by certain contract killers. I've never had proof until now." She glanced at Ranger, then back at Mark. If this is what I think it is, Emily might have been framed by someone wearing her face. Mark felt a tightness in his jaw. The pieces were shifting, and the picture they formed was darker than he'd hoped. "I need confirmation," he said. "I can get it tested," Nina replied. "I know a contact at the university, biomaterial specialist, trustworthy. Give me a day or two." Ranger, sitting at Mark's side, shifted slightly, ears tilting toward the window as if listening to something distant. Nina noticed the movement and smiled faintly. "Looks like he agrees." They spent another hour comparing notes, Nina pulling up files on her laptop, showing Mark a series of deaths among witnesses linked to the Crimson Viper, all ruled accidents or unsolved crimes. The pattern was undeniable, a quiet culling of anyone who might have testified. Mark felt the old weight of unfinished business settle on his shoulders again. When he and Ranger finally left the office, the afternoon light slanted across the narrow streets, casting long shadows. The air smelled faintly of river mud and the promise of rain. Mark walked a little slower, his mind turning over what they had found. Beside him, Ranger moved with the steady stride of a working dog, but his eyes kept scanning, always searching, as if he too understood that the hunt had only just begun. That evening at home, Mark set the evidence bag on the table beside his notes and poured himself a cup of black coffee. Ranger lay near the door as usual, ears occasionally twitching. Mark's thoughts kept returning to Emily's face in the courtroom, the steadiness in her eyes even as the verdict fell. He wondered if she had suspected the depth of the conspiracy that had been spun around her. He sat long into the night, writing down the chain of connections. Sloane's name circled at the top, Hale's beneath it, arrows linking them to the murdered witness, and now a new arrow pointing to the torn, synthetic fragment. Ranger shifted in his sleep, letting out a soft whine as if dreaming of the moment at the courthouse door. Mark looked at the dog and said quietly, "We're getting closer, partner. Whoever did this left their trail, and you found it." The rain had returned to Charleston by the time Nina Brooks received the lab results. The storm swept in from the coast, laying sheets of water over the harbor front and turning the narrow brick streets slick and dark. In the small newsroom, lit by the pale glow of computer monitors, Nina sat hunched over her desk, with a phone pressed to her ear, her other hand clutching a pen so tightly her knuckles whitened. The man on the line, Professor Harold Ling, a biomaterial specialist from the local university, had a voice that rasped like paper over stone, carrying the cadence of decades spent in laboratories rather than public speaking. He confirmed what Nina had suspected. The fragment Mark and Ranger had found was not human skin. It was a high-grade synthetic polymer with cellular texturing, the kind used in experimental lifelike masks, almost impossible to detect under standard surveillance. Nina thanked him and ended the call, staring for a long moment at the rain tapping the window pane. Her reflection in the glass looked tired, late 20s, dark smudges under determined brown eyes, chestnut hair pulled back in a rough knot, freckles on her pale skin faintly visible even in the dim light. She reached for her jacket and the worn leather shoulder bag that carried her camera, recorder, and a battered notebook that had been her companion through countless late-night stakeouts. She drove through the rain to Mark Dawson's townhouse, a brick building whose shutters rattled softly in the gusts. Ranger greeted her at the door with a deep woof, tail stiff but not unfriendly, as if recognizing her as an ally. Mark stood behind the dog, his tall frame outlined in the lamplight, shoulders slightly stooped, the weariness in his blue-gray eyes softened by the spark of renewed purpose. He offered Nina a seat at his cluttered table, while he poured coffee strong enough to steam even in the damp air. Nina laid the printed report on the table, its pages slightly crinkled from the humidity. "It's synthetic," she said without preamble. Whoever killed that witness didn't just frame Emily. They impersonated her. This isn't just corruption. It's calculated. Mark leaned forward, forearms on the table, his square jaw tightening as he scanned the report. That means someone inside knew how to manipulate the security system, plant the fingerprint, and had access to this technology. That's not just Sloane's smugglers. That's a network. Before Nina could answer, Ranger's ears pricked, and he rose to his feet, amber eyes fixed on the window. Mark followed his gaze and glimpsed headlights through the rain. A moment later, there was a knock at the door, measured, official. Mark opened it to reveal a man in his late 30s, wearing a soaked trench coat over a dark suit. His hair, black and slick from the rain, framed a pale face with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that carried both fatigue and resolve. The man introduced himself in a low, steady voice. "Special Agent Daniel Reese, FBI," he said, holding out a badge. "We've been watching Sloane's network for a long time. I heard from an old friend that you found something that might change the game." Mark stepped aside to let him in. Reese removed his coat, revealing a lean build and the subtle stiffness in his left shoulder of a man who had once been injured and learned to live with the ache. He carried himself with the controlled composure of someone who had spent years navigating bureaucratic walls to reach the truth. His expression softened slightly at the sight of Ranger. "This must be the K-9 who tried to defend Carter at the courthouse," he said, nodding respectfully toward the dog. Ranger's ears twitched, and after a moment he lay down again, watchful but calm. Nina briefed Reese on the synthetic fragment and her investigation into the series of silenced witnesses. Reese listened without interrupting, then asked to see the evidence bag. He turned it over in his hands with a frown. "We've suspected that someone in Sloane's circle had access to covert tech, maybe ex-military. This pretty much confirms it. We've got a warehouse district under surveillance, but Sloane's always a step ahead. If you've got more leads, now's the time." Mark hesitated, then reached for the stack of notes on the table. He showed Reese the diagram he had drawn. Names, connections, arrows. All of this points back to Hale. He controlled the initial investigation and the evidence. If Sloane's got protection at that level, we can't trust the local chain of command. Reese's dark eyes met Mark's steadily. "That's why I'm here. The Bureau's been waiting for the right proof to pull Hale down. But we need something we can present in court, not just suspicions." As the three of them spoke, Nina's phone buzzed with an alert. A new video feed from the harbor's traffic cameras had been leaked to a local blog. Grainy footage showing a figure resembling Emily Carter near the warehouse on the night of the murder. But the way the figure moved, too precise, too mechanical in its gestures, made her heart pound. She turned the screen toward Mark and Reese. "This is what they fed the public. If we can get the unedited footage, we might catch a flaw." Reese nodded. "The Bureau can subpoena the servers, but if Hale's been scrubbing evidence, it might already be gone. We'll need to find the original backups, off-site storage, maybe even private cloud accounts." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows. Mark stood and reached for his jacket. "We'll start with Sloane's shipping fronts down by the docks. If someone's smuggling high-tech masks and scrubbing camera feeds, they're moving hardware through those crates." Nina followed suit, tucking her notebook into her bag. Reese pulled his coat back on, checking the holster at his side by instinct. Ranger stood at the door, tail stiff, ready as if he understood his part in the mission. The team that had formed almost by accident was now united by purpose. They drove together in Reese's unmarked SUV to the waterfront district. The rain-slicked streets gleamed under scattered street lamps, and the sound of the tires on wet pavement filled the silence between them. The docks were nearly deserted, save for a few late-night workers huddled under the awnings of shipping offices. They parked near a warehouse whose sign read East Harbor Freight, a company long rumored to be one of Sloane's fronts. As they approached the side entrance, a young man in a raincoat stepped out from behind a stack of crates, startled by their presence. He looked barely 20, with a lean frame, dark curly hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, and eyes that darted nervously between them. Reese held up his badge. FBI, we just want to talk. The young man swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. I don't want trouble, he said, his voice carrying the rough edge of the city's dockside neighborhoods. I just move crates. I don't ask questions. Nina stepped forward, her tone firm, but not unkind. We're not here to bust you. We just need to know if you've seen anything. People coming and going late at night, carrying things that don't look like shipping supplies. The young man hesitated, then nodded slightly. There's a back room, near the cold storage. Big guys come in with locked cases. Don't use the main gate. I keep my head down, but... He glanced at Ranger, whose eyes never left his face. Sometimes I hear voices saying the name Hale, like he's the one keeping the heat off them. Reese gave the man his card. If you see anything else, call me. You'll be protected. They moved deeper into the warehouse, the smell of damp cardboard and rust heavy in the air. Ranger's nose worked constantly, and at one point he stopped, sniffing near a loading bay, where a faint chemical scent lingered. Reese knelt to inspect the floor and found a shred of plastic wrapping similar in texture to the synthetic fragment. He slipped it into a small evidence bag, sealing it as Mark and Nina exchanged a look. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to align. By the time they left the docks, the rain had eased to a mist. The lights of the city reflected in puddles across the uneven asphalt. Ranger leapt into the SUV's back seat, shaking water from his coat, and settled with his head on his paws, eyes half-lidded, but still alert. Back at Mark's townhouse later that night, they laid out the new evidence and planned their next steps. Reese contacted his office to initiate a warrant for further searches, while Nina began drafting the first lines of a report that would shake the city once it went public. Mark watched Ranger as the dog lay at his usual post by the door, ears flicking at every distant sound. The former detective felt a renewed sense of purpose. This time, they weren't chasing shadows. The shadows were starting to leave footprints. The night that followed was thick with the scent of rain and salt, the streets of Charleston shimmering beneath street lamps whose halos blurred in the mist. Mark Dawson sat behind the wheel of the FBI's unmarked SUV, its wipers sweeping rhythmically as they waited in the shadow of a shuttered seafood cannery near the waterfront. Next to him sat Special Agent Daniel Reese, his dark eyes fixed on the dimly lit warehouses ahead, his right hand resting on his thigh near the holstered weapon. In the back seat, Nina Brooks tapped quietly at her laptop, its blue glow reflecting on her freckled face, as she compiled notes for the report she hoped would soon expose Sloan and his enablers. Ranger lay beside her, head up, amber eyes fixed through the window on the empty street, every muscle alert, as if sensing a predator in the dark. Earlier that day, they had pieced together the tip from the dock worker Eddie and a new lead from a bureau informant. A large transaction of unmarked crates had been moved under the cover of the storm to an abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of the city. Reese believed the crates contained not just contraband, but the specialized equipment used to produce the synthetic masks. They needed proof, photos, samples, something that would connect the operation directly to Sloan and Hale. Mark checked his watch, his stubbled jaw tight with anticipation. If they're moving anything, it'll be tonight, he said in a low voice. His years as a detective had taught him the language of waiting, but the part of him that still bristled against injustice felt caged. Reese nodded slightly. Intel says their truck's leaving around midnight. We tail it. No lights, no siren. We need them to lead us to the storage site. The minutes stretched. The rain intensified, drumming softly on the hood. Then Ranger's ears twitched, and he gave a low, warning rumble from deep in his chest. A moment later, the rumble of a diesel engine rose from the far side of the cannery. Through the windshield, they saw the headlights of a large black box truck emerge from an alley, its wheels splashing through a puddle as it turned onto the narrow street. Two figures in dark hooded jackets stood by the rear gate, watching the truck depart before melting back into the shadows. Reese started the engine and eased the SUV into motion. They followed the truck through the winding industrial roads, keeping 2 car lengths behind, lights off, trusting the darkness and the rain to keep them hidden. The truck wound its way out of the city center toward the less populated outskirts, passing old rail yards and warehouses, heading steadily north. As they crossed a narrow bridge over a swollen creek, a set of headlights appeared behind them. Too bright, too close. Mark glanced at the mirror, his brows drawing together. "We've got company," he muttered. Reese's eyes flicked to the side mirror. "They've spotted us. Hold steady." But the tail car accelerated, closing the distance. Mark gripped the wheel tighter. "Looks like they don't want witnesses." Nina glanced back, her fingers curling around the edge of her laptop. "Do they know we're law enforcement?" "They'll assume anyone tailing them is trouble," Reese said, his voice calm but tense. "If they try to box us in, we'll have to improvise." As the truck ahead took a sharp right into an old industrial park, the car behind surged forward, its high beams flaring. Reese snapped his seatbelt taut. "Go wide on the corner, Mark. Give us room." Mark turned sharply, tires hissing on wet asphalt. The pursuing car swung wide too, trying to nudge their rear bumper. Ranger gave a sharp bark, his body tensing as if ready to leap. Reese drew his pistol, but kept it low, eyes on the mirror. The chase twisted through the narrow lanes of the industrial park, the rain-slick pavement reflecting the flicker of the truck's taillights ahead. Mark's jaw clenched as he fought the wheel, trying to keep sight of the truck while evading the car behind. Then, without warning, the truck ahead veered into a gated compound, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. The gate slid open as if by remote control, and the truck disappeared inside. The gate began to close again. Reese cursed under his breath. "They've got a hideout in there. We can't let that truck disappear." Before Mark could respond, the car behind rammed their rear fender, spinning the SUV halfway around. Nina gasped, clutching the seat. Ranger let out a deep, angry bark and lunged forward, his front paws braced on the center console, as if ready to join the fight. Mark slammed the SUV into reverse, gunning the engine just enough to jolt them free of the tail car's attempt to pin them. Reese rolled his window down halfway and aimed low, firing a single shot at the tail car's front tire. The car skidded, slowed, then stopped as its tires shredded against the wet asphalt. Without wasting a moment, Mark swung the SUV back toward the compound. The gate had nearly closed. He gunned the engine, and the SUV slipped through with inches to spare, sparks flying as the side mirror grazed the steel. Inside the compound was a wide yard lit by harsh overhead lamps. Stacks of crates and 2 smaller trucks stood parked near the entrance to a large warehouse, whose doors were partly open. The box truck they had been following was backing into the loading bay. Ranger's head shot up again, ears forward, nostrils flaring. He growled low, then barked sharply, pointing his muzzle toward a darkened corner near a pile of pallets. Mark followed the dog's gaze and caught sight of a man crouched behind the pallets, raising a rifle. "Down!" Reese barked. Mark braked hard as the rifleman fired, the shot sparking off the SUV's hood. Reese returned fire with precise bursts, driving the attacker to retreat behind cover. Nina ducked low in the back seat, clutching her laptop protectively. "We need to get evidence, not a shootout," she hissed. "Working on it," Reese replied grimly. Mark maneuvered the SUV behind a stack of crates for partial cover. Ranger, still on leash, but straining forward, let out a low, furious growl. His whole posture was that of a seasoned K9, who had seen danger before and was ready to protect his team. The warehouse doors rattled as the truck inside began unloading crates. Mark spotted a side door to the warehouse ajar, its lock broken, likely from hurried use. "We need to get inside before they move the goods," Mark said. Reese nodded, motioning for them to move. Reese slipped out first, moving in a low crouch toward the side door, his weapon raised. Mark followed, keeping his body low, with Ranger at his side, the dog's focus unshakable. Nina, determined despite the tremor in her hands, came last, clutching her camera under her jacket. Inside, the warehouse smelled of oil, damp wood, and something acrid like solvents. Rows of crates lined the walls, some marked with shipping codes, others unmarked. Near the center stood two men in dark jackets, moving boxes onto a pallet jack. A third man stood watch with a pistol at his hip, his heavy-set frame silhouetted against the overhead lamps. He had a thick neck, close-cropped hair, and a face roughened by years of street fights, his expression the hard mask of someone long used to violence. Reese motioned silently, and Mark signaled Ranger. The dog crept forward on silent paws. The heavy-set man turned just in time to see Ranger spring, the shepherd's weight knocking him sideways. His pistol clattered to the floor as he tried to shield his face, cursing. Reese advanced, covering the two other men, who froze at the sight of the armed agent. Mark moved to a nearby crate, pried it open with a crowbar he found leaning against the wall. Inside were sealed packages of the same synthetic polymer they had bagged as evidence, along with molds shaped disturbingly, like partial human faces. He felt a grim satisfaction. "Got it," he said. A sudden shout from outside warned them that more men were coming. Reese ordered the two men by the pallet to get on the ground and stay down. Mark clipped Ranger's leash back on, the dog still bristling but obedient. They began to retreat toward the side door as footsteps pounded closer. Reese covered their exit as Mark and Nina moved toward the SUV. A second later, the door slammed open and two men rushed in, one with a crowbar, the other with a handgun. Reese fired a warning shot, and the men dove behind cover. Ranger snarled but held his ground at Mark's command. The three slipped out the side door and sprinted for the SUV. Rain hit their faces as they jumped in. Mark started the engine as Reese leapt into the passenger seat. A shout rose behind them as figures spilled out of the warehouse. But Mark floored the accelerator, the SUV fishtailing on the wet pavement as it sped toward the gate. The gate was still ajar, and they shot through it into the dark street beyond. Only when they were several blocks away did Mark slow enough for Reese to radio in their position and request a tactical team to secure the compound. Nina sat back, breathless, but already pulling out her camera to review the shaky footage she had managed to capture during the raid. Ranger settled on the seat, wet fur dripping but eyes still sharp, as if waiting for the next move. Reese looked over at Mark. "We've got the proof. Now it's just a matter of keeping it safe until we can bring down Sloan and Hale." Mark nodded, glancing briefly at Ranger in the mirror. "We're one step closer to clearing Emily's name." The night air in Charleston carried a sharp bite, the kind that found its way through old stone walls and into the bones of those who waited too long in the dark. Mark Dawson stood at the window of his townhouse, watching the street lamp's pale glow spread across the slick pavement. His tall frame was tense, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if still bracing for the next blow. On the rug nearby lay Ranger, stretched on his side, but with his ears angled forward, ready to spring up at the slightest sound. Behind Mark, Nina Brooks sat at the table with her laptop, her brown eyes sharp behind the tired shadows of sleepless nights, while Special Agent Daniel Reese leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. They were reviewing the evidence from the raid, photographs of crates filled with synthetic polymer and face molds. It was enough to expose Sloan's smuggling of the technology, but they still needed the records, transactions, victim lists, proof that the conspiracy reached Hale's office. Reese's voice was low but firm. "We've traced the shipments. One more delivery is scheduled tonight to a refrigerated storage site outside the city limits. Intel suggests Sloan's keeping his most sensitive material there. Backups of client lists, masks, and probably the ledger that links Hale to the operation. We have one shot before they move it." Mark glanced at Ranger, who raised his head as if sensing his partner's intent. "We go in careful," Mark said. "This time, we get what we came for." Meanwhile, in a secure wing of the county jail, Emily Carter sat on the narrow metal bunk, her back straight, despite the chill that seeped through the concrete walls. Her chestnut brown hair had come loose from the practical knot she always wore, and strands framed her pale face. There was a faint shadow under her gray-green eyes, a sign of many sleepless nights. The guard delivering dinner trays paused at her cell. He was a lean man in his 40s, with a lined face and watchful eyes, named Carl Hughes, known among the inmates for his quiet fairness. He set down the tray, but lingered a moment, his voice pitched low. "You watch yourself. Something's off tonight. I heard someone asking questions about you in the wrong places." Emily nodded once, offering a faint smile of gratitude. "Thanks, Carl." She had learned to trust her instincts during her years on the force, and they now told her that time was running short. Rumors had reached her through the prison grapevine. There were people who wanted her gone before any appeal could be heard. That night, she made her decision. As the guard's footsteps faded, she began to study the screws that held the bunk's lower frame to the wall, her mind calculating possibilities with the cool focus that had once made her a decorated officer. Back at the townhouse, Nina pulled on her weathered denim jacket and slung her camera bag over her shoulder. Reese checked his sidearm and the extra magazine at his belt, then glanced at Mark. "We move now. The longer we wait, the more chance they have to clean out that cold room." They drove in silence, the city giving way to long stretches of dark highway, lined with pines. The night smelled of damp earth and distant marsh. Ranger sat upright in the back, his black and russet coat bristling slightly, as if he sensed the tension. The refrigerated storage site was a low, concrete building surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A few dim security lights cast pools of yellow on the wet asphalt. Reese parked the SUV a short distance away, and the three moved out on foot. Mark carried a small crowbar in his jacket. Nina had her camera and flashlight, and Ranger padded ahead, silent as a shadow. At the gate, they found the lock surprisingly easy to break, as if someone had grown careless. Inside, the building's heavy metal door bore fresh scuff marks. Reese motioned for silence, then pushed it open. A gust of cold, sterile air swept out, carrying the faint smell of disinfectant and chemicals. Rows of tall storage units lined the corridor, their metal doors rimmed with frost. The hum of refrigeration units was the only sound. Ranger moved forward with slow, deliberate steps, nose low to the ground. He stopped near a door marked with a faded number 17 and gave a soft whine, his amber eyes flicking up at Mark. Reese stepped forward and tried the handle. It was locked with an electronic keypad. Mark glanced at Nina, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing as she produced a small portable scanner from her bag. She wasn't a hacker by trade, but years of investigative reporting had taught her more than most civilians knew about bypassing simple security systems. Within a minute, the lock clicked open. Inside the cold room, shelves lined both walls, stacked with sealed crates and plastic-wrapped binders. A steel table in the center held what looked like a disassembled face mold next to a ledger book with a cracked leather cover. Reese pulled on gloves and flipped the ledger open. His sharp eyes scanned the neat columns of transactions and names, pausing at the entries that listed large sums next to the initials RH and VS. "This is it," he said. "Hale's signature isn't here, but these coded initials and the payment trails are enough to pull him into the net." Nina began photographing everything, her breath visible in the cold air. Mark moved to the shelves, prying open a crate and revealing dozens of synthetic face masks, each unnervingly lifelike in its frozen expression. His jaw tightened as he turned to Reese. "This is how they framed Emily." Suddenly Ranger growled, a low rumble that vibrated in the air. Mark spun toward the door just as it creaked open. A man in his 30s stepped inside, tall and wiry with slicked-back blonde hair and a thin scar cutting across his left cheek. His pale eyes widened at the sight of them. This was no ordinary worker. His stance was too balanced, his gaze sharp with the calculation of someone used to violence. Without a word, he reached for the pistol at his belt. Ranger lunged before the man could fire. The shepherd hit him square in the chest, knocking him backward into the shelves with a crash that sent crates toppling. Reese moved fast, kicking the pistol away as the man struggled under Ranger's weight. Mark grabbed a length of nylon cord from the shelf and bound the man's wrists, while Nina kept her camera trained on the scene. They worked quickly to gather the ledger, a sample of the masks, and a portable drive they found plugged into a terminal at the far wall. As they prepared to leave, they heard the faint wail of distant sirens. Reese's call for backup had gone through, and the Bureau's tactical unit was on the way. The captured man glared at them, but said nothing, his pale eyes full of silent fury. By the time they emerged into the night, FBI vehicles were pulling up, their red and blue lights cutting through the mist. Reese handed over the suspect and evidence to the arriving team leader, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named Captain Jeff Monroe, who wore the plain black jacket of field operations and carried himself with the calm authority of years spent on high-risk raids. He gave Mark and Nina a brief nod of acknowledgement before turning to issue orders to secure the site. As the evidence was loaded into the Bureau's armored van, Mark rested a hand on Ranger's thick fur. The dog's ears were still forward, his breath coming in slow pants from the exertion, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Good work, partner," Mark murmured. Nina stood beside them, her face pale from the cold, but her brown eyes alight with determination. "When this goes public," she said softly, "Emily's story will finally start to make sense." Reese joined them, glancing at the cold building one last time. "This is the break we needed. With the ledger and this guy's testimony, Sloan and Hale won't be able to hide behind shadows anymore." Far away, as dawn edged the horizon with the first pale light, Emily Carter lay awake on her bunk, listening to the distant hum of the prison's generators. She didn't yet know that the tide was beginning to turn, that her old partner and the dog who had never given up on her were one step closer to bringing the truth to light. The first rays of the South Carolina dawn spread across Charleston's skyline, like the gentle opening of a long, shut window. The harbor shimmered in the soft gold of morning, the tide pulling away from the pilings with a quiet sigh. The Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge rose in the distance, its cables and towers outlined against a pale horizon, promising a day unlike any other the city had seen in years. Mark Dawson stood near the railing of the bridge, his tall, lean frame silhouetted against the rising sun. His dark blonde hair, still damp from an early shower, stirred in the cool breeze. Beside him sat Ranger, the 5-year-old German shepherd, his black and russet coat brushed and gleaming, amber eyes bright yet calm as they watched the line of approaching cars. The weeks leading up to this day had been a storm of headlines, court sessions, and late-night debriefings. With the ledger recovered from the cold room and the testimony of the scar-faced enforcer, the Bureau had finally broken through the wall of silence. Victor Sloan had been arrested during a sting at his Riverside estate, his once impeccable appearance crumpled as he was led away in cuffs. Robert Hale, stripped of his badge and title, had been charged as a co-conspirator. The evidence had revealed a network that reached far beyond Charleston's port. And yet, the revelation had also brought the city a breath of relief. Emily Carter's exoneration had followed soon after. The courtroom where she had once sat in chains had echoed with the judge's declaration clearing her of all charges. Now, standing a short distance away from the railing, Emily waited for the ceremony to begin. At 32, she bore the marks of the ordeal, her face a shade thinner, the gray-green eyes deeper set. Yet there was a new steadiness in her posture, like a tree that had bent beneath a storm and grown stronger in the wind. Her chestnut brown hair had been trimmed short to her shoulders, framing her face in a way that softened, but did not diminish the strength of her expression. She wore a simple navy blue blazer and slacks, a nod to the uniform she would soon wear again. Nina Brooks stood nearby with her ever-present leather bag slung over one shoulder, the morning light catching the copper highlights in her chestnut hair. Her brown eyes, quick and observant, softened as she watched Emily kneel for a moment to brush her fingers over Ranger's head. Nina had covered the entire story, from the first whisper of corruption to the front-page exposé that had rocked Charleston. She now wore a modest black dress and jacket, practical for the occasion, but softened by a silver pendant at her neck, a gift from her mother after her first big story years ago. Special Agent Daniel Reese, dressed in a clean dark suit, stood a little apart, his hands clasped behind his back as he spoke in low tones with Captain Jeff Monroe, the field commander whose team had secured the cold room. Reese's sharp features were more relaxed than they had been in weeks, though the slight stiffness in his left shoulder still betrayed the old injury he carried. Monroe, broad-shouldered and steady-eyed, glanced toward the gathering crowd of citizens, city officials, and members of the press who had come to witness the public recognition of Ranger and the restoration of Emily's honor. The mayor of Charleston, Margaret Ellison, arrived shortly after. She was a tall woman in her mid-50s, with short, silver-streaked hair, a warm brown complexion, and the poised demeanor of someone who had spent decades navigating both political storms and community crises. She wore a tailored cream suit and carried herself with the composure of a leader intent on bringing unity back to the city. A small platform had been set up at the center of the bridge, decorated with banners in the city's blue and white colors. A lectern stood ready with a single microphone. Behind it, a row of chairs awaited the honored guests. As the mayor stepped forward, the low murmur of the crowd quieted. "Today," Mayor Ellison began, her voice carrying clearly in the fresh morning air, "we stand on this bridge as a symbol of connection between past and future, between justice and those who fought to see it served. We are here not only to welcome back Officer Emily Carter, but also to honor the courage of a four-legged partner who never lost faith in her." She gestured toward Ranger. The German shepherd stood as if understanding his name had been called, ears pricked forward, tail still, but proud. His amber eyes scanned the crowd briefly before returning to Emily's face. A ripple of applause moved through the assembly, soft at first, then stronger as more people clapped, some whistling appreciatively. Mark watched Emily step forward to accept the mayor's handshake. He felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest, the kind that came not from victory, but from the sense of a burden finally lifted. He remembered the first night he had brought Ranger home, the dog staring at the door as if waiting for someone who might never return. Now that someone stood before him, cleared of shame, welcomed back by the city she had once protected. Mayor Ellison continued, "We bestow upon Ranger the title of Guardian K9 of Charleston, in recognition of his unwavering loyalty and bravery. Through storm and shadow, this dog stood as a silent witness to the truth and helped bring light where it was most needed." A young aide in a crisp white shirt and navy vest stepped forward, carrying a polished plaque mounted with a bronze emblem of the city's crest and an engraved plate bearing the title. Emily knelt beside Ranger as the plaque was presented. For a brief moment, the bustling bridge seemed to fall silent. Emily placed a steady hand on Ranger's ruff and looked into the dog's eyes. "We kept the oath, partner," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but caught by the microphone. "We didn't give up." The applause rose again, louder this time, joined by a few cheers. Reporters raised cameras. The morning sun glinted off their lenses. Nina discreetly wiped at the corner of one eye, hiding the motion behind the strap of her camera. Reese stepped forward next, shaking Emily's hand firmly. "Glad to have you back on the right side of the badge," he said, his tone dry but carrying genuine respect. Emily smiled faintly. "Glad to see there's still room for people who don't give up." As the ceremony drew to a close, Mark moved to stand beside Emily. For a moment, they stood quietly together, leaning slightly against the railing as the harbor stretched out below. Ranger lay at their feet, head resting on his paws, but eyes half closed, as if content to finally rest. "You thinking about going back on the force?" Mark asked. Emily glanced at him, her gray-green eyes softer now. "I am." Not because I want to wear the badge again, but because I want to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else." Mark nodded, his lips tugging into the hint of a smile. Charleston could use more people like that. The morning breeze tugged gently at their clothes, carrying with it the scent of the river and the distant sound of a cargo ship's horn. It felt as if the city itself was exhaling after a long, hard-held breath. As the officials began to pack up the platform and the crowd slowly dispersed, Emily remained kneeling for a few final moments beside Ranger, her hand resting lightly on his strong shoulder. She murmured something only he could hear. Ranger's ears flicked forward at her voice, and for the first time since that long day in the courtroom, his tail gave a single, slow wag. The sun climbed higher above the horizon, casting warm light across the bridge, gilding the faces of those who had fought for truth and endured loss along the way. The harbor beneath shimmered as if welcoming the new day, and the bridge stood tall against the sky, a promise of paths ahead, not yet taken, but now open. After all the storms and shadows, Ranger's life had turned a final page. The loyal German shepherd who once waited outside a courtroom door now stood on the Ravenel Bridge as the sun rose, no longer burdened by doubt or loss. Beside him, Emily Carter faced the dawn of her own new chapter, redeemed, unbroken, and ready to serve again. Their journey through betrayal and danger had bound them together as more than handler and canine. They had become living proof that courage and loyalty can outlast the darkest nights. Now, as Charleston breathes in the calm after the storm, let us wish Ranger and Emily the peace they have earned, and hope the road ahead is gentler than the one they have traveled. If you felt moved by their story, give it a like, and follow me for more thrilling tales where loyalty, justice, and the unexpected twists of fate continue to unfold.